Our next section is 6.5, where it again is still talking about rhombuses, rectangles, and squares. So quite a few theorems at the beginning. It says if the diagonals of a parallelogram are perpendicular, then the parallelogram is a rhombus. So if my diagonals form a right angle, I know it's a rhombus, so the converse of what you just got done discussing. 6.17. If one diagonal of a parallelogram bisects a pair of opposite angles, then the parallelogram is a rhombus. So again, the opposite of what we just discussed. 6.18. If the diagonals of a parallelogram are congruent, then the parallelogram is a rectangle. Again, the converse of the last theorem we just got done using. So these questions are asking you to conclude if I have a rhombus, a rectangle, or a square. So look at the first one. Notice that I have a diagonal that bisects the opposite angles. So this one would be a rhombus because my diagonal bisects the opposite angles. And that would be my explanation. Next one. Notice you have diagonals forming right angles, and you have diagonals that are congruent to each other. So what this ends up being is twofold. If my diagonals form a right angle, that means I'm going to be a rhombus. If my diagonals are congruent, that means I'm going to be a rectangle. Every time you have a rhombus and a rectangle, that means it's going to end up being a square. So I have several things that I have to say. I first identify that it's a square. Then I have to say my diagonals are congruent, which makes it a rectangle. My diagonals are perpendicular, which makes it a rhombus. So remember, a rhombus makes these four sides congruent, and then a rectangle gives me those four right angles. So that's how it ends up being a square. So be very careful, because if you get both of those things, you'll want to say it's a square. Alright, you try and do the last one, so pause the video. So on the very last one, you should be getting a rhombus because my diagonals are perpendicular. Okay, so next piece then is going to actually find what x is so that we can see if it's a special parallelogram. So question 7. 7 is asking me to find what x is so that it's a rhombus. Okay, so if I'm a parallelogram, remember that I end up getting this angle and this angle supplementary. Remember, my consecutive angles are supplementary if it's a parallelogram. Well, if it's a rhombus, that means that that diagonal will bisect those two angles. So what you could do is set up an equation. I could say that 2 of these, so that's why I did 2 times 2x minus 1, plus this angle, which is 4x plus 28, is 180. So I'm using the fact that parallelograms have consecutive angles supplementary. Then I also use the fact that rhombuses have the diagonal bisecting that angle. So then I would just solve it. Distribute, so I get 4x minus 2 plus 4x plus 20 equals 180. Simplify, so 8x plus 26 equals 180. Minus 26, and then divide by 8. So my answer would be x equals 19.25. Let's talk through the next one. So the next one is saying you want to find what x is, so it's a square. So notice they're giving me this angle. So if I have this angle, remember a square will have the diagonals bisecting this angle. And I also know that each angle in a square has to be equal to 90. So again, you're using several things in order to solve these. So what you could do to set it up would be take 2 times this expression and then set it equal to 90. So I would do distributing, so 14x plus 6 equals 90, minus the 6 and divide by 14, so I get x equals 6. Pause the video and see if you can do the last 2. So the last 2 are pretty easy because you just have diagonals. So on number 9, I see my diagonals bisect each other, so this has to be equal to that for a rectangle. So you could just set them equal to each other and solve. So if you solve it, you should be getting x equals 5. Same question on 10. My diagonals bisect each other, so I can just set those expressions equal to each other. Minus 1x minus 10, so 48 equals 2x, and then divide so you get 24. If at any point you have questions, please pause the video and let me know. Otherwise, go ahead and start on your assignment.